Once upon a time, a very long time ago, there lived a man named Antonio Stradivari. Stradivari was an extraordinary violin maker. He conjured magical musical instruments out of the most ordinary blocks of wood. Their tone was like a nightingale's song, pure and strong and sweet. Other craftsmen grew curious. What made Stradivari's violins so special? But try as they might, no one could discover his secret. And the cunning Stradivari told nobody, carrying it with him to his grave.
It sounds like a fairy tale, doesn't it? But the amazing thing is that it's all true. Ever since I started learning the violin as a child, the name Stradivarius has held an almost mythical appeal. In the 17th century, Antonio Stradivari made over 1,000 instruments, and about 600 of them still survive. But a Strad is so much more than just a musical instrument. Each one is like a little miracle in wood, and for violinists, they're the ultimate holy grail. The prospect of playing one, let alone owning one, is an almost unimaginably thrilling prospect. For me, though, part of the enchantment lies in the fact that 250 years after his death, we still don't know how he did it. We still have never really discovered Stradivari's secret.
Although I stopped playing the violin seriously in my teens, I've remained a bit of a violin geek. So this summer's exhibition at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford is a rare treat. For the first time ever in Britain, it brings together 21 of Stradivari's finest instruments from museums and private collections all around the world. Every single one has an incredibly rich history, but I've singled out some of my favourites. This is the story of Stradivarius, told through 4 very special violins. We'll never know when or where the very first violin was made. The fiddle seems to have appeared fully formed during the 16th century. For me, the Stradivari story really begins in the 1560s, 80 years before his birth, when his hometown of Cremona in northern Italy became the violin-making capital of Europe. The earliest violins were an accompaniment to lively nights in the tavern.
But in more refined circles, the fiddle was frowned upon. It might be an appropriate plaything for a peasant, but it was hardly deemed appropriate for courtly entertainment or religious services. In parts of Italy, the church even ordered the destruction of this supposedly licentious object.
But something happened to change the fortunes of the violin and Cremona forever. This curious new instrument entranced Catherine de' Medici, one of the most powerful women in Renaissance Europe. Captivated by its unique sound, she ordered a set of 38 new violins from Italy.
And they were all made in Cremona by Antonio Stradivari's forefather, Andrea Amati, the very first master violin maker in history.
This violin was one of the instruments that Amati made for Catherine de' Medici in 1564. It's the oldest surviving violin in the world. quite so emotional holding it. What is just mind-boggling is that this doesn't look like a first draft. This doesn't look like some rough and ready prototype. This is what it is. This is a violin. It's very light. It's slightly smaller than a modern instrument, but... This early violin was made, like all those that followed it, out of maple wood. Its form is beautiful, but it's functional too. The curves equalise the resonance at all frequencies, where a simpler shape would favour one note over others. The first piece of music written for the violin, composed by Catherine de' Medici's court musician, may well have been played on this very instrument. I feel like music's one of those things that connects us all through time and through history, and it's so ephemeral. You know, we hear it, it's just molecules and vibrations in the air, but to actually hold the object that would have played the first piece of violin music ever written. It's just completely bewilderingly wonderful. Andrea Amati and his family dominated violin making for the next 100 years. But in the middle of the 17th century, a young Cremonese craftsman emerged who would go on to challenge the Amati's crown. His name was Antonio Stradivari, and his oldest fiddle is here in the Ashmolean Museum. One of the things that really adds to the allure of Stradivari is that he seems to come out of nowhere. We know very little about his birth or his childhood. It's almost as if he arrives with this. This is his first known violin, and it's known as the Serde. It was made in 1666, which is the same year as the Great Fire of London. We do know from later records that Stradivari was about 22 when he produced it. I have been waiting for this moment for pretty much my entire life, it feels like, because I'm actually going to be allowed to hold this Strad and even to play it. This is the first time in my life that I've ever held a Strad. It's just something that as a violinist you grow up dreaming about. Never, ever, ever imagine that you'll be able to actually do it. A few things about the Serde suggest it's the work of a novice. The slightly awkward arching of the back and the irregular details on the corners. But it also has features that would become Stradivari's trademarks, like the sound holes and the scroll. One of the really interesting things about this violin is the label, which reads Antonius Stradivarius Cremonensis alumnus Nicolai Amati faciebat anno 1666, which suggests that perhaps Stradivarius really was a pupil of Amati. If so, it's the only shred of evidence that we have that he was, if indeed it is evidence. I do wonder if he did study with Amati, or whether it was just a great career move to suggest that he did. It's tantalising to think about the music that might have been played on the Serde by its very first owner. Stradivari was a contemporary of the great Johann Sebastian Bach, so I'd like to think that it might have been one of my favourite pieces, Bach's Concerto for Two Violins in D minor. I've asked Jennifer Pike, who I met through the Young Musician of the Year competition, which she won aged just 12, to come and help me put the Serde through its paces. Do you ever does it ever get less thrilling to play a Strad?
I don't think so, no. That kind of feeling of awe never leaves you.
It feels fitting to play Bach on a Strad, I think.
Absolutely, yeah.
Shall we have a go?
Let's have a go.
Jennifer's playing a Strad from the exhibition, and I've been allowed to play the Serde, Stradivari's earliest violin.
Nice. The tone really is unbelievable. What do you think, because you obviously play on an amazing violin all the time, but what makes the tone different? What makes it so special?
I don't know, each violin has its own voice in a way. This is really mellow, it's just, it's so warm, it's like sitting by the fire.
It's like an old friend.
Yeah, it is like an old friend.
Even though we just met. I don't think I ever really want to give it back either. You don't mind, Ashmolean, if we never give them back, do you?
The year after Stradivari made the Serde violin, he married a local girl, and their first child was born a slightly unorthodox 4 months later. He was now a contented family man. But professionally, Stradivari had yet to reach the height of his powers. It was not until over a decade later that his career really took off. And I get the sense that, as well as his phenomenal technical skill, he also had a very good manner with his clients. There's very little documentary evidence about Stradivari's life, which makes what we do have incredibly precious, like this letter I've got a copy of here. Now, my Italian is a bit rusty, but he writes, "Most illustrious and excellent Sir, I didn't send the violins sooner because I was waiting for somebody trustworthy. And I pray you to forgive me for not sending it more quickly, and I hope you will appreciate it. I remain yours. Your very modest and devoted servant, Antonio Stradivari." And it's dated Cremona, the 23rd of August. Now, we don't know who this very illustrious and excellent Sir was, but I'm extremely envious of him. Imagine getting a letter like this from Stradivari. I think you'd forgive him being late, wouldn't you? Michael Cairns has been making violins for 40 years. The methods he uses have hardly changed since Stradivari's day, and he shares my admiration for the great craftsman's skill. As a violin maker, is it possible to say how a Strad is different from everything else?